Well, we're going to be looking at a lot of history today, and history that is incredibly important. What I want to emphasize is that our rituals of Holy Week developed organically. By that I mean they began from the bottom up. It wasn't that someone decided, oh, we're going to do this, and then they start putting it together. No, it's what the faithful began doing, and everything kind of bubbles up, and eventually what the faithful are doing becomes the way we celebrate. There is a Latin phrase that we use a lot in theology, and it's called lex orandi, lex credendi. And what that means is that the law of prayer, lex orandi, becomes the law of faith, lex credendi. So when the church wants to know what direction to go in, it really looks to see, well, how are the faithful praying? And it's from the prayers of the faithful and the beliefs of the faithful that so much of what we have comes to be. So that's what's really kind of nice about Holy Week, is that it is extremely organic. There's going to be some dates that become very pivotal in the development of Holy Week and how we do it today. The first date is 325, which is what's called the Council of Nicaea. Then comes 1470, the Council of Trent. Then nothing for about 1600 years till we get to 1951. And then again in 1955, again in 1970. So it's amazing how things sort of were set and cast in stone around 325. Let's say cast in stone carefully. They continued to develop for a while, but then in 1470, the Council of Trent says, okay, we're going to do this, this, and this. And that doesn't change until 1951. So some may remember the rituals of Holy Week prior to 1951, which were very different than what we do today. Prior to 1951, Holy Week was almost the exclusive domain of clergy. The faithful typically didn't attend much of Holy Week unless you sang in the choir or did something like that. And a lot of it was because what we do on Thursday, Friday, Saturday was all done on Saturday. So things have changed through the years. The beginning of it all, of course, is Easter. And Easter is not seen as its own thing until late in the 2nd, early in the 3rd century, is what we call Easter Sunday truly become its own thing. Because in the mind of those early Christians, every Sunday was a celebration of Easter. They didn't need to see a separate moment for that. But again, saying that it's organic in its development, people began to want to celebrate in a special way that historic moment of the resurrection of Christ. And from the Gospels, it's fairly datable because the Gospels refer to the Passover and Jesus gathering for the Passover meal. He's betrayed in the garden, and the next day, boom, 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 things happen. Now, when we say it's datable, there was in the 4th century, or in the late 3rd century, there was quite an argument about when will Easter be? When will we celebrate that day? Because people want a special day. And it was all over the map. In those days, pretty much, because of the Jewish calendar in which things happened, the Jewish calendar is a lunar calendar. The Western world was beginning to adopt the solar calendar, or what we call the Roman calendar. And that created some issues that by 325 in the Council of Nicaea they had to deal with. I'm going to take these off. They keep slipping down my nose, and I keep... Following the scriptures, there was a group in the East, a very large group of Christians in the eastern part of the Roman Empire. They knew the Passover was the 14th day of Nisan. And so the Passover was set by the first day of the full moon in the first month of spring. That's when Passover was celebrated. in the first day of the full moon in the first month of spring. And it didn't matter what day it fell on. That was Passover. And so, which would have been on the Jewish lunar calendar, the 14th of Nisan. And so in the East, in a lot of places, that's what they were celebrating. The first day of the full moon in the first month of spring. But toward the western part of Europe, and particularly in Rome, they began to develop a different way of setting Easter. It's still around the 14th of Nisan, but because in the West, the Roman calendar was being used and not the Jewish calendar, kind of had to, fix it. Plus, the faithful preferred to celebrate Easter on a Sunday because for, a couple centuries now, every Sunday was Easter. So they wanted to keep this special celebration on a Sunday. So the other group began to argue the first Sunday after the first 14th of Nisan. So it'd be the first Sunday after the first full moon of the first month of spring. Now, it's hard to say, and I'm glad, you'd have to almost be an astrologer or astronomer to, kind of set those dates. But after a lot of going back and forth, eventually what we have today won out, especially in the West where Rome was. And it's interesting that the first group, because they wanted to celebrate on the Passover itself, they tended to emphasize the redemptive death of Jesus Christ. And that was really their primary focus, which would make sense because of the connection of death, of Jesus' death with Passover. But then the second group, not that they weren't looking at the same thing, but what they wanted to emphasize was the resurrection and the exaltation of Jesus. So again, the days and how we celebrate affected what they were going to emphasize. Again, listening to the faithful, the way things develop, what won out was the Sunday celebration of Easter, and consequently on Easter, the emphasis of the resurrection. This was formally decided in 325. And that was the Council of Nicaea. It was not until 325 that it was definitive when Easter would be celebrated. So, not quite 300 years, but a number of years had passed since the death of Jesus. It didn't create a huge controversy because, again, this is as the faith spreads and the church is experienced in Europe and other places, this is kind of what was mostly happening. The East wasn't real happy about it, but it is what it is. Now, it's interesting that beginning in the 1950s, there was a move by the World Council of Churches to fix the date of Easter. Rather than having it be a movable feast, the way it is, because it's set on the lunar calendar, they wanted to pick a specific date, and that date every year would be the celebration of Easter. They wanted to do that for a variety of reasons. One, the historicity, how definite was it that, when Jesus died, which is the year is a little iffy. We know it happened around Passover, but not all the Gospels agreed that it was on Passover. The Gospel of John has Jesus dying on the day before Passover. There's a significance in that, why John put it that way. So, all of these many years, the World Council of Churches in the 1950s wanted to set a particular day. And a lot of that was because in the Western world, the way things were going, it just people need to plan their years and plan their dates, and companies needed to know when employees would need to be off. So the reasons they were doing that were not really theological, but practical for the way the world was developing. Now, it's interesting that the Eastern churches, what we call the Orthodox churches, they were the ones that wanted to keep, the day of Passover as the celebration, but, became what it became with this Sunday. But they are the ones that strongly objected to setting a specific date. And the World Council of Churches decided, unless we're all on board, we keep doing it the way we're doing it. And the East said, no, the Eastern Christians said, no, we want to keep it the way it is. And so, smartly, they decided, if we're not all on board, we're going to keep it the way it is. But just, kind of as a trivia thing for you, because Easter can move, it can move as many as 5 weeks one way or another. The absolute earliest that Easter would ever be celebrated is on March 22nd. That's the absolute earliest. The absolute latest is April 25th. Just in the way it's set on that lunar calendar, March 22nd is the absolute earliest Easter can be. April 25th is the absolute latest it can be. So if Easter falls in March, we'd say it's kind of early, and it's April 1st this year. So it is kind of early in that possibility. I have seen Easter as late as April 25th on the last possible day that could be celebrated. Now, as the notion of celebrating Easter developed, the faithful wanted to celebrate not just the resurrection, but all of it, what we call the Pasch or the Passover. Pasch means Passover, but it doesn't have a sense of Passover. It has a sense of passing through. That's really the meaning of the word, to pass through. Of course, the night of Passover, the angel of death moved through Egypt. And so when we talk about the Easter celebration, Paschal celebration, it's our moving through the death, the resurrection of Jesus. In the minds of those early Christians, the 3 events, beginning with the Last Supper, the Passion and the death, and Last Supper not so much in the very beginning, but the Passion, death, and resurrection in their minds could not be separated. They just couldn't conceive of that. So it all had to be looked at, celebrated on the same day. So for about 3 centuries, what eventually becomes the Easter Vigil, they celebrate all of it on one day. What we now call Holy Thursday, the Mass of the Lord's Supper, the Passion and death, and then the resurrection. And as they're celebrating it all on one day, the times begin to become important on when to celebrate these things. And the celebration, the whole celebration, had to end no later than, but had to end at midnight. They didn't, because it all led up, because after midnight, the new day has begun, and that was the day, that they were going to rejoice and have a great time, and they really didn't do Mass or celebration on what we now call Easter Sunday, because they'd all done it the day before. Well, time goes on, and here they are celebrating this, and they're kind of concerned about the time, so it has a sense of time to it, because God reveals Himself in time. They kind of like our argument now with midnight Mass. People call the rectory, "Father, what time is midnight Mass?" and in some, we're one of the few that still have midnight Mass at midnight. So a lot of people, you'll call one of the churches and say, "When's midnight Mass?" 10 o'clock. So midnight Mass is at 10 o'clock. But those folks were no different than us. It's like, oh my gosh, it's late. And whoo. So people, just again, the faithful over time began pushing up the time, and then this grave concern came in that the celebration was ending way too early, before this midnight time. So what do we do about that? So to acknowledge how the faith of the people were moving, they began to set it up so that the midnight didn't matter anymore, and they started separating the events that they were celebrating. And initially, it's just sort of Good Friday, Holy Saturday, and because they were ending before midnight, but way too early, they began to go, okay, we've done the vigil, we've celebrated the resurrection of Jesus. Then they began to add a Sunday celebration. So for the first two and a half centuries, they didn't. Historically, they didn't celebrate Easter until late 2nd century. Then when they do start celebrating it, it's a day that was, it was not a day that like we celebrate it now, because they did it all on Saturday. But then, as people like us, it's like, oh, it's late, and so they change things, and then they begin to celebrate with Mass, with the liturgy, on Easter Sunday. And that all is developing around early 4th century. And again, at the Council of Nicaea, 325, they say, okay, Germany's doing it this way, France is doing it that way, although these countries didn't exist as such, but basically the Germans, the Franks, and all the Spaniards are all doing it these different ways that are similar yet different. So in 325, in the city of Nicaea, the bishops voted, said, this is the way the whole church is going to do it. Our notion of the Triduum, which means 3 days, that it begins in the evening with the Mass of the Lord's Supper. On Holy Thursday, there's not to be any other Mass but that one Mass. Now, the only exception to that is what we call the Chrism Mass, which the rituals kind of show it being celebrated. Today's rituals show it being celebrated on Holy Thursday morning. But since all the priests are required to be present, you just can't do that anymore, especially with some of our dioceses that are so big, like ours, geographically so big. So many dioceses move it to earlier in the week, either Tuesday or Wednesday, depending on the size of the diocese, and we have it on Wednesday of Holy Week. But the official Triduum begins with the evening Mass of the Lord's Supper, and it does not end until evening prayer on Holy Saturday night. That's when it comes to, Easter Sunday. So from in the name of the Father and Son and the Holy Spirit on Holy Thursday until priest and religious celebrate evening prayer on Easter Sunday does the Triduum end. Now, because it all begins as one day, the notion of the Triduum the way we have it today, even though we have institution of the Lord's Supper, and then we have Good Friday, and then we have the Easter Vigil, Easter Sunday, even though we have kind of spread all of that out, the church still sees Holy Thursday, Good Friday, Easter Vigil. We still look at it as only one celebration, one continuous celebration, even though we have it on 3 separate days. When we come Holy Thursday night, and the bishop begins, we sing the entrance hymn, and the bishop say, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, he'll begin. The Triduum begins with that invocation of the Trinity and the sign of the cross. We will not make the sign of the cross again until the end of the Easter Vigil. So when we come back on Good Friday, there is no beginning with the sign of the cross. When we begin the Easter Vigil, there is no sign of the cross. So we begin with the sign of the cross on Holy Thursday, we end at the Easter Vigil, to emphasize that even though we've separated the components, it's still one long celebration. Now, at the Council of Trent, 1470, they set out what the rituals would be and how they would be done. And at that time, they continued to celebrate everything on the same day. That's the way the church did it for 1,600 years, until 1951. And in 1951, the church, and again, places were doing, the faithful were doing kind of what we're doing now. Various places around the world and in Europe, they had begun with, those radical liberal priests of kind of separating out the components of the of what we now call Holy Thursday, the institution of the Eucharist, the death of Jesus, Good Friday. They began, let's just celebrate this now. We'll do that other later, and then let's do this, and then we'll celebrate that other later. So in 1951, the church acknowledged that that's what the faithful were doing. So because the faithful were praying this way, it's interesting, it said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We are going to have Holy Thursday, Good Friday, Easter Vigil on Saturday. That was allowed in 1951, and it was called an experiment. They called it an experiment. Then, in the reform of the liturgy in 1955, at that point, it was set that, yes, this is the way we're going to do it. Now, by 1955, all of the smart people, the liturgists and all of that, and theologians, they saw the Second Vatican Council coming, because a lot of the writing and everything that shows up at the Second Vatican Council, which began in 1962, most of all of that was already being talked about by theologians and bishops prior to that. So in 1955, when they took the 1951 experiment, knowing what was coming, they designed Holy Week in light of what they thought the new liturgy would look like that would come during the Second Vatican Council. Now, in those 1600 years, all on the same day, initially we went from the celebration of the Lord's Supper to the Vigil, but in the many, many, many initial years, there was no celebration that we would call Good Friday, that there was no liturgy for it whatsoever. Beginning in Germany, about the 16th century, the people, again, began to want to somehow mark the death of Jesus. And so they basically began gathering. Would read the Scripture, read the Passion. There was no formal content to it, just sort of people would make it up, but whatever they wanted to do, no harm, no foul. But the heart of the faithful, especially in Germany, around the city of Mainz, they had this urgent desire to celebrate. Celebrate's kind of the bad word when we talk about a death, but they wanted to mark the moment. So they began doing things. Then the Franks began to pick it up, and they began doing things. Now, in kind of this development of wanting to keep time, wanting to somehow be present to the death of Jesus, they completely understood that, from the Mass of Holy Thursday to the Easter Vigil, that there were no sacraments performed. And that's until this day, that from the beginning of Holy Thursday Mass until the end of the Easter Vigil, priests may not perform sacraments, except in danger of death. And the only other exception to that is a priest may hear confessions on Good Friday, which during our Traore we have started doing. And it tends to be, the cathedral doesn't have a penance service like a lot of parishes, but we might as well say the Traore is our penance service, because 4 of us will be hearing confessions for the entire 3 hours and then some. And those are the only exceptions. So, if I were going to be really, really strict, person shows up on Holy Saturday and wants to go to confession, an hour before we begin the vigil, I'm really supposed to say, no, I can't. Of course, person wants to go to confession, there's hardly a priest that will say no. But also there are those that show up 5 minutes before Mass, was trying to get in our vestments, said, Father, I got to go to confession before the Easter Vigil. It's like, it's kind of unfair to us. And there was one time a person was really indignant about it. I said, well, you have sinned just by insisting that you go to confession this close to Mass and disrupting everything. So as you confess, make sure you bring that up. That person never came back to Mass with me. But they got, I see them all the time, but they got the point. What began to develop over time is sort of what we do now, is the reading of the Passion and adoration of the cross. So that begins. Now, it's called the adoration of the cross, not the adoration of the crucifix. Although we use the crucifix, obviously we use it, especially here in a big way. We take that humongous Jesus off the wall and we set it up in the main aisle for people to reverence. And what do we all do? I do what you do. We either kiss the feet of Jesus or the hands of Jesus, sort of kiss one of the wounds of Jesus. But that's sort of a modern adaptation, because it wasn't an adoration of the body of Christ. It was an adoration of the cross. And so that really kind of sneaks in late. That sneaks in after 1970. And in all the instructions, it talks about adoration of the cross in terms of the rubrics, the rules about here, you do this now, you do this now, and then you pray this prayer, and then you do this, that big red book, it has it all laid out, and it always saying adoration of the cross, the cross is brought out, and all of that, until a certain point that it switches and says crucifix. And so it's like, okay, church, what do you want? And I think there was an intention there to leave it rather ambiguous, so, again, no harm, no foul. So as things develop, and the Good Friday is kind of the last piece of this to develop. It's way after the 14th century. Not that they didn't keep something or people didn't do something individually, but we really don't start seeing it sneak into the church until later. And then somebody in Rome decides, okay, clearly the faithful are doing this. But again, the same problem. They were doing that in Germany, that in France, that in Spain, that in China. I mean, it's just all over the place. So they said, here's what we're going to do. And so it became reading of the Passion, adoration of the cross. Somewhere along the line, not necessarily the people, this is a little different, but the clergy felt badly that they weren't having Mass and weren't receiving communion on that day. It's never really been a rule, but it has always been the custom that priests would say Mass every day. Now, there is no rule that a priest must say Mass every day. The only day of the week I don't say Mass is Monday, my day off. But a lot of priests will get up early and still say a Mass on their day off. The promise we make is to pray the Liturgy of the Hours every day, or the Breviary. That we promise when we're ordained a deacon. But still, the custom and the spirituality of priests was they wanted to say Mass every day. And it really sort of frustrated them that as Holy Thursday and the Easter Vigil start to get separated, we have this long Friday, frustrated them that there was no communion. So they began to, on Holy Thursday, consecrate enough host so that they, the priests, could receive communion on Good Friday. So what you would see if you went to church, you would see the Passion being read, then you would see the adoration of the cross, and then the Eucharist would come out, the priest would receive, and then it was all put back. And it really is not until very late, until we start getting into 1951, again, as an experiment, that they began to allow the faithful to receive communion on Good Friday. So, and this time it's not so much the faithful, but at least it was the priest that wanted to receive communion. Well, if the priest wanted it so badly, because it's the body of Christ, well then the laity started wanting it too. And so eventually, lex orandi, lex credendi, the way we pray is what becomes the way we believe, that begins to allow and call for the Blessed Sacrament to be distributed. So now we have Passion, Adoration, and Holy Communion. But still, there is to be no Mass. For a while, they began to talk about Good Friday as the day that we have the broken Mass. Because there is no Eucharistic prayer, so they just called it the broken Mass. And kind of keeping with, with the notion of what the day is all about. If we were really going to be purist about it from the point of view of theology, we would not allow communion on Good Friday, because we're celebrating, the death of Jesus in the world without Christ until the Easter Vigil. So it really, in some ways, theologically, it doesn't kind of fit. Spiritually, different story. So there's theology, and then there's spirituality. Now, in this, very early in the celebration of Holy Thursday, or the Mass of the Lord's Supper, the idea of washing feet was very popular. In fact, up until about the 3rd century, washing feet was part of the baptism rite. And only around the 3rd century did that start to disappear. And again, why does it disappear? Because for the faithful, it didn't make sense. It's It made sense at one time in history because the Jewish people did a washing of feet, so they kept doing a washing of feet. But as the church really completely removed itself or just moved from Judaism, it just got to the point that, why are we doing this? And so with the lack of interest, it falls off. But then it starts to sneak back in, but on Holy Thursday. Until 1951, it was always done after Mass was over. Beginning in 1955, it's put where it is now, after the homily. In the early years of it, in fact, up until about 1470, the Council of Trent, the washing of feet, the instructions that they had, that we still have from the prayer books of those days, was that bishops and priests were to wash the feet of the faithful as a sign of their servant role to the people of God. Beginning with the Council of Trent, the church begins to become very patriarchal. Things start to change. And then we get the instruction, but actually instruction doesn't come until late. And again, we're getting back up into the 1950s, that it's to be 12 men. Now, why did we go from washing the feet of the faithful, which would have been men, women, children, and there was no notion of 12. It was an act to be done. And then getting up toward, after the 15th century, but really as we're starting to get into the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and set in the 1951, what changed? Well, the emphasis of what that symbolized changed. That it went from symbolizing the self-sacrificing, serving nature of Jesus Christ that's embodied by the clergy, by what we do. Instead, it began to segue into an idea of celebrating the institution of the priesthood. So it went from revealing the priest as servant acting in the person of Christ to trying to say this is when Jesus instituted the priesthood. Now, a little difficulty with that historically and theologically, and again, this was a time when it wasn't so much the faithful, but it was the priests themselves that drove that change. Now, what do we see in our lifetime today? Even with the updating, we had the experiment in 1951, the updating in 1955, and all of that said 12 men. After the Second Vatican Council, when the new missal came out in 1970, said 12 men. But what starts to happen? Well, because the institution of the priesthood is a little bit forced, the laity wisely began to see, wait a minute here. Isn't this about how Jesus serves us? And so, in the minds of you, the faithful, and I agree with you, but I'm going to separate myself. I'll be a cleric. I'm going to be really clerical right now, just for the sake of talking about it. I, as the cleric, would say, oh no, 12 men, because it's institution of the priesthood, where the faithful, you, were saying, really? And it's the original symbol, washing the feet at baptism, that drops out, but then people began to see it as a sign of the service of Christ. And in the beginning, it was, the instructions were that the bishop and the priest were to wash the feet of the faithful. There's no mention of age or anything. Well, the faithful, you began to perceive, organically began to perceive, well, that really is what this should be about. And so there has been this huge movement of saying, let's not worry about the 12 men, and let's get, and of course in the minds of the faithful, most people don't know this, so you can't go back, nobody was arguing, let's go back. But for you, the faithful, the meaning of the symbol, the meaning of it is perceived differently. So, a few years ago, the Vatican allowed, in this whole question of washing the feet of just men, the Vatican changed a little bit, and it said, in terms of who gets their feet washed, the national organization of bishops, they are the one, you can do what you want. In other words, if you want to keep it this way, bishops in the United States keep it this way. If you want to change it, you can change it. The American bishops voted to change it, so that in the United States it became permissible to wash the feet of anyone and everyone. They didn't even have to be Catholic, because, as I preached a few years ago, it's not about who gets their feet washed. It's about who does the washing. And to take that, it's not so much, the priest and the bishop do the washing. No, it's Jesus Christ that does the washing. And that is the embodiment of being a self-sacrificing servant. In the scriptures, the washing the feet belonged always to the lowest ranking servant or slave in the household, because they didn't have streets the way we have. They kind of open sewers. They had stepping stones, so you could not have to walk through the stuff in the street, throwing the chamber pots out in the street and the day-old food, and occasionally they would open up the taps of the fountains and they'd wash all that stuff out. Well, it's pretty nasty walking through the streets, as you can imagine, the stuff that would be on your feet, which when you entered a person's home, you immediately took off your sandals, because nobody wanted you tracking that stuff into the house. But then, before you fully entered the house, as a sign of hospitality, the lowest ranking servant or slave would wash the feet of the guest as they came in the house. So there was a practical consideration there. Didn't want tracking that stuff all through the house, but it also became a way of emphasizing service. So when Jesus washes the feet of the apostles, and John, Peter objects, said, Lord, I should be washing your feet, and it was a way of recognizing, a statement of faith to say that. And Jesus said, no, I'm going to do it, and I want you to pay attention. And then of course Peter will say to Jesus, well, Lord, if you're going to wash my feet, wash my head and hands as well. And for him to say that, it's on the one hand a sort of a literal sense of being bathed in your entirety, but the YMCA, when we want to talk about the whole person, it's mind, body, spirit. Well, they talked about head, hands, and feet, the whole person. So Peter is kind of this literalness, but on the same time in the hands of John, it's wash my whole person and not just my feet. Cleanse the whole person. And then Jesus will say, this is all that is necessary. This is all that's necessary. But what Jesus is doing is, you remember we get that phrase at Mass, do this in memory of me. Do this. And so when we say that, it doesn't just mean, raise the host, raise the chalice, say these words. No, it's to take the whole Paschal mystery. That's what we do in memory of Jesus. Bishop Choby was kind of a purist, so he insisted that it be 12 men. We haven't broached the topic with Bishop Spalding yet, but I cheated and I called his parish and I said, what did he do for Holy Thursday? When he was pastor. I said, he had women, children, prisoners that could get out to go to Mass. So I think we'll see a little bit of a change this year. When I want to know what he's going to be like, I call a couple of the priests I know that were in his that either worked with him as associate pastors or are still in his parish. They tell me all kinds of secrets. And it's important to note that with the whole 3 days, the Triduum is the center of our liturgical life. Every celebration, whether it's Christmas on one end or Christ the King on the other, every single celebration points toward the passion, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. After the acclamation of faith, we acknowledge that the passion and the death of Jesus Christ, or sometimes it's broken up a little bit, but every particular liturgy, every Eucharistic prayer, always passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. They are inseparable. There was a time from the end of Holy Thursday until the Easter Vigil, there was a time, especially in Europe, that after the Easter Vigil, the Blessed Sacrament was removed from the church. That's ancient practice. So people would file out, they'd shut the doors and they'd nail them shut. So nobody could even go in the church on Good Friday. Remember, there were no celebrations initially of that, no keeping of that, but they'd actually just nail the church door shut. Some of the really old churches that still have their original doors, you can see where they nailed planks to the doors to keep them locked. And again, to emphasize, the world without Christ. The only remnant of that we have today is that on Good Friday, there are to be no lights in the church. Now, because we celebrate after dark, there's a little bit of a safety issue. So yes, we turn on a few lights to do our celebration, but we keep it really low key. And especially when you come in for the Easter Vigil, it's just barely enough light to find your seats. Because when we light the Easter fire, the new light coming into the world, that's the light that's to light up the church. And I always wish that people could have my perspective at the Easter Vigil, because when I get up the altar and turn around and everybody's holding a lit candle, it's just spectacular. It's just spectacular. So it's a view that I'm privileged to have, and people that might be serving at that particular celebration. Church bells did not really come into use until later in development. We're looking 6th, 7th, 8th century, thereabouts, before bells really started being used at church. Bell towers, and some of the reason is bells just weren't easy to manufacture, so it just wasn't a part of church life the way it is today. With bell towers and all of that. We in all the movies of the Middle Ages, you always tend to hear a church bell in the background ringing. But as bells did begin to come into churches, because of the notion of the sadness of Good Friday, or actually it begins with Holy Thursday, because there wasn't Good Friday as we have it today, but once the Gloria was sung on Holy Thursday, and in Holy Thursday, in many ways we could look at it as the vigil for Good Friday, because even though we're celebrating the institution of the Blessed Sacrament, all of the prayers refer to the death of Jesus. So, on the one hand we're celebrating the Eucharist, but on the other hand we're really looking at Good Friday and on Holy Thursday. But beginning around 850, it was forbade to use bells in the church from the Gloria on Holy Thursday until the Easter Vigil, at the end of the Easter Vigil. Now, when it was all on one day, they used bells at the beginning, and then they weren't used again until after midnight, because they were supposed to be finished at midnight. And then, of course, they began to use the bells on, as we began to have Mass on Easter Sunday. Remember, poor folks, they couldn't stay up late anymore. Like I struggle for midnight Mass Christmas. They quit that. Then eventually organs are developed. And again, this didn't come into later until organs began to be developed. Initially, they were not the first choice for church instruments. They were seen as being very secular and used for, organs were kind of used for secular music and not good things. It was very suspicious. But because it became a very beautiful type of instrument, the organ begins to be introduced into the church, especially as they move from polyphony, a type of chant, into singing of hymns. You got to accompany them, so the organ is brought into the church to accompany hymns. But again, like the bells, as the organ becomes one of the mainstays of Christian worship, even the organ was to be silenced. So from the end of the Gloria on Holy Thursday until the Easter Vigil, there was to be no organ used. And if you'll notice, the only thing Jackson uses our organ for is to give a pitch to the singers on Good Friday. We don't use the organ anymore. We actually, Holy Thursday, we actually walk out in silence.
Did you say the organ is silent from Holy Thursday to when?
We use it, the last time we use it is in the singing of the Gloria on Holy Thursday until the Gloria at the Easter Vigil. And then we crank it up. In setting the days, as they begin to be separated, something we don't see much anymore, but many of us remember a practice of 40 hours. where the Blessed Sacrament was exposed for 40 hours and people came. That actually came from the early days of the Easter Vigil as they began to separate off Holy Thursday from the Vigil itself. It had to be set up so that it was 40 hours from Holy Thursday to the Easter Vigil. And that's kind of where those 40 hours came from. And it's a concept of Jesus dying and how many hours passed until the resurrection. And so, and again, 40 is a very, whether it's accurate or not, who knows. But 40 is a very scriptural number. We hear 40 years in the desert, 40 days, for the Jews, 40 days in the desert for Jesus. The number 40 has a symbolic meaning, not just 40 days, but in the way the Jews would use numbers to not only as adjectives, meaning a quantity, they would also use adverbs or numbers to represent quality. So the quality of 40 has a sense of enough time to accomplish a task. So 40 years in the desert, 40 years for Jesus, 40 days in the desert for Jesus. That notion of 40, so the 40 hours, kind of enough time to accomplish something. The fast on Good Friday that we do, we have fast, which are very spiritual, to cleanse ourselves, and people today will fast for health reasons, if not spiritual, to kind of cleanse themselves. But for Good Friday, the fast had an intentionality about it that it was to be a grieving fast, in which grief is emphasized as opposed to any possible other thing. Throughout Lent, we fast and abstain, but the notion of the Lenten fast is not grieving, it's that we fast so that others may eat. And that's the notion of our Lenten fast. So when we say we're giving up things for Lent, the purest sense of it is, it's not so much we give up something for Lent, we give away something for Lent. So if we fast and abstain, then what we would have eating ourselves, we just don't leave it in the refrigerator. I'm just not going to eat today. But the notion is that because I fasted, it provides food for another person. So that's kind of the notion of the Lenten fast. Whereas the Good Friday fast is one of grief. How we always hear, people grieving and they say, I'm just not hungry, but that's the notion of a grieving fast. Beginning around the 2nd century, in the records that we have, the fast was extremely severe. So for that time period that they kept, there was to be no food or water, period. The only exception was for the sick and pregnant women, and they were allowed bread and water, but no food. I'm kind of glad we moved on. And that is a little bit lessened. But the first time, really, I talked about, around the 12th, 13th, 14th century, they really began to kind of do something special with Good Friday. The first record we have of anything being done is from a woman by the name of Egeria. And she was from Europe, I forget where, but anyway, she had made a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, which by the 400s was a very popular thing to do. The Holy Land had not been conquered yet, there hadn't been any kind of problems. And on her pilgrimage to the Holy Land, and all through the Holy Land and on a return, she kept a diary. We've got a lot of that diary still left to us. But in her diary, around the year 400, she described Christians gathering at Golgotha, where they would read the Passions, where they would act it out a little bit, where they would meet in prayer. And she's kind of taken by that and tries to do something like that when she gets home. It didn't last for a lot, but as early as 400, we know the Christians were, on Good Friday, they were going to, or on the Passover, they were going to Golgotha, which we know where that is, so they were going there to pray. We do know that by the 7th century, there was a practice of the Pope carrying a cross. He would be barefoot, but the Pope would be barefoot, and he would carry a cross from the Lateran Basilica, St. John Lateran, which is the Cathedral of Rome, and that was the home of the Pope for more centuries than the Vatican's been. The Vatican was a hill outside the city, and the popes just went to the Vatican during the summertime because it was cooler there. That was kind of the summer retreat, but they spent more time living at the Lateran than they did there in the Vatican. But he would walk barefoot from the Lateran to the Church of the Holy Cross. Pretty significant little walk in the city of Rome. Church of the Holy Cross was, supposedly St. Helena found the cross, or remnants of it, and so a piece of that was brought to Rome. She built, from her own money, the Church of the Holy Cross, which still stands and still has whatever it was she brought back. So the Pope would carry the cross from the Church of John Lateran to the Church of the Holy Cross, and so there was sort of that pilgrimage. That was about it. That was in the 7th century. 8th century, France, there's records of people sort of acting that procession out in France. 10th century, the German monks are really the ones that in the monasteries begin doing the passion, the passion of Christ. We also want to note that the instructions, because of the solemnity of the Passion, now on Palm Sunday we rotate reading from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. This year we're going to be reading from from Mark. Now, people say, is that good? Well, it's neither here nor there, although Mark is the shortest. That's the good part. But always, for whatever reason, the Gospel of John is read on Good Friday. But the instructions are very clear that a solemn profession or a solemn proclamation is to be understood as something that is sung. So the instructions are very clear that where you have the ability and the talent, the gospel on Good Friday is to be sung, which fortunately we got the talent and the ability. So it's sung here, which is the first preference of the church. And the exception to that is if you do not have competent musicians, then it may be read. And quite frankly, very few of our parishes have the talent necessary to do that. Also, and it's still in in our rubrics or in the rules, the Good Friday celebration is to occur at 3 o'clock. That is when it's to be done. Well, we do it at 7:30. What's going on there? Well, it was to be done for centuries, it was to be done at 3, but if you couldn't do it at 3, you could start it a little bit later, but it could never start after 6 o'clock in the evening. It had to be sometime 3 o'clock, it started a little later, but it had to be finished by 6 o'clock. Well, it's still in our rules, it still says Good Friday celebration is to be done at 3 o'clock. And then it has a phrase you see all through the rules, unless for pastoral reasons, for the good of the faithful, so that they may attend, you can start it at a later hour. And that was an acknowledgement in the 1970s with the new ritual 1970, but especially a little bit later than that, an acknowledgement that as the world becomes a little bit less Christian, one time, Holy Thursday, Good Friday were holidays. They were holy days, and holy day and holiday was the same thing, or synonymous. But but then it got to where, in especially Western countries, Good Friday is not a holiday. Some businesses, they may shut down at noon. They don't fuss really if Christians want to go to their churches. At least most don't fuss about it. But if we were to do it at 3, probably not have near the congregation we would have, as in starting it later. But that's the preferred hour, because that's, the scriptures say at the 3rd hour Jesus died, and that, that's why that was picked. That's a whole lot of history and a whole lot of moving parts. But what I hope you hear in all of that is that what we do today has been constantly evolving. It was set in stone for 1470, but then the faithful It's like, okay, this was the rule, this is what the church said, this is what we're going to do. And then, getting into the 30s and 40s, the faithful start taking over again. The way people believe, the way they express their faith, the church began to change and began to relook at all these things. So by 1951, we enter into the world of experiments. Let's see if this works. 1955, it's kind of, it's redefined, and then, but it's not. By 1970 is when the new missile came out that became definitive, and that's what we have today. The one that was released 4 years ago, it doesn't really change the rites at all. It just retranslates the prayers, but the rites are still the same. So there you have it.
Wow. What was the name of the lady that built the church?
Of the Church of the Holy Cross?
Yeah.
St. Helena. Or Helena, yeah.
She was the mother of Constantine?
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
You said the other one was Hegira?
Egeria.
How do you spell that?
Egeria.
They still have the Passion Play in Germany.
Obergammerau. And just so you know, when Bishop Smith, he took a year and he went to the Obergammerau Passion.
I went there too.
And he was so taken by it, he wanted to bring something back to remember. That's where the corpus on the cross came from. He brought that back from Obergammerau.
Has adult baptism and confirmation always been associated with the Easter Vigil?
Yes, that almost always, as they really, it's always been associated with Easter. And then as the notion of the Vigil developed, it goes, at the Vigil, we light the new fire, the new light of Christ, Paschal candle, light of Christ, and then we bless holy water, because after Holy Thursday, we get rid of all the holy water. And so since we re-blessed the water, as time progressed, the baptisms done on Easter moved to the Easter Vigil, because that's when the water is blessed.
And how do you spell the council in 325?
Nicaea, Nicea. It's one of the most important councils. It's where our creed, the Nicene Creed, comes from. The creed has not had many changes since 325. It's had a couple, but pretty much goes back to 325. Well, for those of us that need to be at Mass in 10 minutes,